Welcome to the Do This for Life podcast with OEV of Be Truly Faithful. I will be in your ear every Wednesday, encouraging ladies to do love, relationships, family, nation building, and good sex for life. Yes, this is where you get to do this for life, y'all. Woo! So let's go into today's broadcast. All right, what's up, family? Thank you for tuning in to the broadcast today. And I'm really just going to jump right in because this is such an important topic to me from the journey that I've had in it, as well as from talking to so many different women. And even when my husband and I talked to so many different couples when it comes to sex, it was so many things that we just didn't know at the time. And we would help so many couples with their sex in their marriage and things like that. And then I would talk to so many single ladies about their sex and eventually sexuality. And it's just something that needs to be talked about more. So as we would have those counseling sessions, I began to study deeper and deeper on sex and sexuality and whatnot, and made some amazing discoveries that was able to help more people. And I want to share some of that today. I want you to listen to the end though, because I will be sharing something that I did with my husband as a single woman. And what do I mean by that? Today we're talking about types of sexuality. Types of sexuality. There's more than just one or two that we normally hear about. We're going to talk a little bit about each of those. I'm not going to go into like this full detail with all of them. We will be here all day because they're adding to them like often now. It's so many different things, and I don't want to confuse you. I just want to give you a bit of the basics today to help you understand. This may help you understand as a single person or one who is married, why you have some of the sexual issues that you have. And let me tell you how this came about. It's not just about the journey my husband and I have had with counseling couples and singles, and me talking a lot to single women, but or married women, but it's also conversations that have come up over the years. And even just recently, a few have come up in the group that I'm over. This woman was talking about how she was, deathly afraid. I think the word she used was deathly afraid of having sex before marriage. And she just wasn't turned on by wanting sex with the man that she's interested in. And so as I was reading through her post, I thought immediately to myself as I was reading, okay, she sounds like a sapiosexual, which we'll talk about in a second. And so I asked her, are you a sapiosexual? And she said, I've been wondering this and whatever she said. And I said, I think you need to research what sapiosexual is. And I think you also need to find out what your sexuality is. I said, because most heterosexual women who are attracted to heterosexual men struggle with not having sex before marriage. The norm in that is not that, because I have struggled with that as well. So it's not that we don't want to have it. Sometimes there's a fear of it, but you still want it. But her thing was not just a fear of it. She actually did not seem to want to have sex. It's like something that was a barrier for her. And the barrier was not just being afraid of sex, or the barrier was not just, oh my goodness, is this going to hurt? It wasn't the normal things that maybe a virgin would fear. It was something more there, and I could read into it. And I was looking, of course, through all the advice that was given, and people were saying things like stick to your guns, stick to your morals. And I was like, I don't see where it's about sticking to your guns or to your morals or values here. There's something a bit more here. And I think this discussion that we're trying to have today is something that needs to be had more often. Just like with mental illness, I think sexuality needs to be discussed more in the body of Christ. This is something that I do a lot of, and I'm going to continue to do it because it needs to be had. And when I hear people say things to me like, this is the kinds of talks that needs to be had at home, this doesn't belong in the church. Listen, we are the church. We are the ecclesia. It's a body of people. It's not a building that you go to. So these discussions I agree, need to happen in the home as well as among the congregants. I mean, we cannot keep sweeping these things under a rug and then sending people into marriage and they're having all these sexual issues that we in the end have to deal so much with. People who do ministerial counseling or professional counseling, we have to deal so much with that because no one asked the right questions before getting involved with someone. No one talked about their sexuality and whatnot growing up as a child or and going into early adulthood. These are things that need to be discussed more. So today I want to start the discussion publicly, outwardly, because I have a Sex for Ladies workshop that I do. Well, I went into depth of sexuality and whatnot over 2 days for 10 hours. 10 hours we sat there and discussed and had this discussion, and I taught these things and educated the ladies on things, and I did it from a biblical and scientific discussion. So let's go ahead and jump right into sexualities, and I can say a lot more here, but I want to really get to the types of sexualities that are out there and why they're important and why it's important for us to know this. And what are some things we can do with this information to help us in our walk in life in general. You won't believe how important all of this really is. So I want to start with a quote that I saw made in the comment section in a post about sex. I cannot remember the person who said it, but it is not my quote, but it is a quote I will continue to use because it is so true. The quote is, "Oftentimes where there is silence, there is unnecessary shame." I wholeheartedly agree with that. Where there is silence, there is unnecessary shame. So when talking about sexuality, a lot of people don't even want to say the word sex. So sexuality is definitely not going to be something that's talked about. So when it's talked about, it's like we just hush with it because it's either you're heterosexual or you're in sin as a homosexual. That's all there is. There is no in between. Anything outside of heterosexual is wrong. It's sin. And that's all we've been really taught for years, for decades in the body of Christ. And it's time out for that, because it's time out for the silence, because it's ruining generations. You do realize that when we are silent on things, on matters that are major, really major, that people suffer in silence and they do things to deal with the silence. And they're not the only ones responsible for what they do in the silence. Like, we are always directly responsible for our actions, but many times we are indirectly responsible for the reason people took those actions. Okay. So let's go into and talk about it. Did you know that millennials today in their 20s are very expressive? Y'all notice that they're very, very expressive. But when you really think about back to Generation X, they too were very expressive. They were very expressive. They just did not have social media. So therefore, a lot of times they would record things and talk about things that the previous generation didn't talk about. So now millennials are pushing the envelope even more. They're coming out and recording and putting it on YouTube or going live talking about these things. But the church don't want to deal with that. I have a problem with that because it needs to be dealt with. What affects millennials and Generation Xers affect us all. They're the ones that's pushing the narrative around here. So let's get into it. Sexuality. And there's a reason why I said all that. All right. Sexuality is the capacity for sexual feelings. All right. This is a person's sexual orientation or a person's sexual preference. I'm giving y'all definitions of these things, and I hope you replay this podcast over and over so you can learn these things. Now, from sexuality, that's what we're talking about today. We're talking about sexuality, your capacity for sexual feelings, your sexual orientation or preference. Because a lot of people say we choose. All right. So let's keep going. Now, then you have sensuality. I remember did a radio show for, I forget the name of the show, but they asked me to come on and talked about, can Christians be sexual and sensual? Is it a sin? So one of the things we talked about was sensuality. Sensuality is the enjoyment, expression, or pursuit of physical, especially sexual pleasure. This is the way we respond to all things sex. All right, whether it's sexuality or sex in general. This is the way we respond, our enjoyment, our expression of our sexuality, or our expression of our pursuits of physical sexual pleasure. All right, now let's talk about sexual attraction real quick. I'm just giving you some definitions and I'm giving you lots of the basics. You all can go and research more or inquire about more. Sexual attraction is the desire to engage in some form of sexual act with a particular person. Now, I want to tell you there's something that we normally don't really talk about. Not only do we not really talk about sexual attraction, there is something else called romantic attraction. There is a difference between sexual attraction and romantic attraction. So while we have sexual, listen to the wording, sexual attraction, which is the desire to engage in some form of sexual act with a person or the recipient of this attraction that you have sexually. Romantic attraction is the desire to engage in some form of romantic attachment or deep emotional involvement with a person. Y'all ever hear how women say, I want my husband to be more romantic? And you'll hear a lot of women say this about the men they're in relationships with. Like, I wish he was more romantic, not always about sexual, not always about sex. So there's a difference in romantic attraction and sexual attraction. And this is important because as you go down to sexualities, many of these sexualities deal with primarily sex. Others deal with primarily romantic attraction. There's a difference. And why is it important to know all these different things, right? It's very important, especially for singles. Not saying that it's not important for those who are married, but single people really need to know this today. And there are some things you need to ask the person or people that you're interested in, getting to know better. You need to have the discussion of sex, sexuality, and things like that. You need to have those discussions. I'm not saying you have it on the first date or when you first meet. I'm not saying that, but down the line somewhere, y'all need to have the discussion. This is something that a discussion my husband and I have, and where it may not have been as detailed as I do today is the way I teach it. It definitely was very informative for him that we had this discussion, and I asked very detailed questions of him, and there's a reason why that was, and we're going to get to that. So make sure you listen to the very end. So now we know there's a difference between sexual attraction and romantic attraction. Keep listening, because I'm going somewhere with all of this. Now, sexual orientation is a person's sexual identity in relation to the gender to which they are attracted. That means heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, those types of things. Sexual orientation, which is another way of saying sexual preference, is a person's sexual identity. Yes, we have sexual identities. And these sexual identities are in relation to the gender to which we are attracted. I want y'all to pay attention to the words, to the definitions of things, so you'll understand where I'm going with all of this. So let's go more in detail about sexual orientation real quick. So sexual orientation is about who you're attracted to and want to have relationships with. Sexual orientations, you hear the terminology of gay, lesbian, straight, bisexual, asexual, things like that. So we know that sex, we're not talking about the act of sex, but we're talking about sex as an anatomy. Sex is a label, male or female. We are all assigned by a doctor at birth based on our genitalia that we're born with and the chromosomes we have. And it goes on our birth certificates. So that means male or female. All right. There's such thing as intersex, but that's down the line there. Gender is actually more complex than it's been made out to be. Because of lots of studies being done by scientists and doctors, they're starting to find out they've actually been starting to find these things out, but it's being promoted more now. It's where you can get your hands on these studies now. It was a time that you could not get your hands on these studies unless you were in the medical field. You couldn't get access to these things. You just had to take what the report said in the newspapers and, the media. You couldn't get your hands on it. And then they started making it available in the libraries. And so now we got it to where we can look up this stuff any and everywhere. We have much more access to learning about gender. So it's actually more complex. It's actually seen as a social and a legal status. And it's also a set of expectations from society about behaviors, characteristics and thoughts. This is how we get a lot of times masculine and feminine. And if you notice, a lot of this terminologies I'm using, you can't find them in the Bible. Those words wasn't even out then, like homosexual. This is how you will know that the Bible has been translated and transliterated for centuries on end, because homosexual didn't even appear in any Bible until sometime in the 1900s. I think it was 1960s or 1970s where they put homosexual in there. Back in the Bible days, there was no such thing as homosexuality. That's a modern day term. And we'll get to all of that too. I'm going to try my best to get to as much today because I don't want this to be really long, but this can be a very complex topic, and I'm just trying to give you all the basics today. All right. So gender is more than just about body parts. It's actually more about how you're expected to act because of your sex. So if a woman does certain things that people feel is masculine, she's going to be called out for it. Back in the day, no one thought girls and women should be playing sports. They thought it was for men only. And there's a bit of a debate in that still, that the surrounding of the environment is turning a lot of women gay, that the influence of your sexuality is oftentimes coming from your surrounding. So there's a debate and discussion still being had on that today. We just don't discuss it much in the church. We just put it all under one umbrella. It's sinful. It's demonic. We're not talking about these things. So therefore you have a lot of us who have suffered or have been suffering in silence. And this is one of the reasons why it's so hard to come out and say, well, this is what I feel, or this is what I think on this subject, or I want to question this. And this is why we will continue to have the debate on sexuality. The one that we only really talk about is homosexuality. We don't talk about anything else. Everything else is, you shouldn't even speak about it. It's demonic, so we need to start having the discussion, and the church needs to have these discussions, because what ends up happening is people just go to do whatever and experiment, and then people suffer in silence and never share. We have to speculate. Then it's a whole bunch of things that go on. The world is having the conversation. Why isn't the church having the conversation? On a spiritual level, scientific, level. We need to have these types of discussions. So just remember, when it comes to gender, that each culture has standards about the way that people should behave based on their gender. All right, so now that we talked about a little bit about gender, let's talk about gender identity. Gender identity is how you feel inside and how you express your gender through clothing and behavior and personal appearance. It's actually a feeling that begins early in life. Okay, now there's sexual identity. I know y'all are going to be like, these are so many terms. That's why I say replay this over and over again. Get your Google out, search out, and look up these as you go along. Write them down, take notes, and go back and listen to it again. I may do a live on this, but probably not anytime soon because it's a lot, y'all. And that's just why I have my Sex for Ladies workshop for these types of things. So let's talk about sexual identity. Sexual identity is how one thinks of themselves in terms to who they are romantically or sexually attracted. It can include sexual orientation. So some of these terminology, some of these wordings and definitions kind of overlap. So sexual identity and sexual behavior are closely related to sexual orientation, but they are distinguished, with identity referring to an individual's conception of themselves and behavior referring to actual sexual acts performed by the individual. And then sexual orientation is referring to romantic or sexual attraction towards persons of the opposite sex or gender. All right, so I can't go into so much detail. I only have so much amount of time. So let's just move on. Now, you do have what's called gender assigned at birth. Some people call it GAB, G-A-A-B. Y'all can look that up, G-A-A-B. And then there's cisgender. Cisgender people are people whose internal gender matches the physical sex and are gender assigned at birth. That just means cisgender is basically heterosexual, in other words. But people like to use these different terminologies because now we have, transsexuals and transgender. So non-binary, you will hear that when it comes to sexuality, you will hear binary and non-binary. And let me just be quick with that. Non-binary is basically a catch-all category for gender identities that are not exclusively masculine or feminine. In other words, there are non-binary is identities which are outside the regular gender binary. All right. So meaning some people, it's like cis normativity. Some people feel like they relate to as being both genders, all genders, or none at all. Like don't even quote unquote genderize me. That's not a term they use. I'm just saying that, y'all. I just made that up, right? Non-binary and binary. Now, let's quickly go into the sexualities. You've heard many of these before. Heterosexuality. That's heterosexual is one who is only attracted to the opposite sex. It's also known as being straight. That's what heterosexual is. You've heard of that pretty much all your life. Also heard of homosexual. That's when a person is only attracted to people of the same sex. Make sure you listen to certain words in these. Only attracted, or some people even say heterosexual is primarily attracted to the opposite sex because people say that sexuality is fluid. We'll get to that too. You will hear some people even say with homosexuals that they're same gender loving. All right. Bisexual is someone who is sexually attracted to both men and women. It doesn't mean that they're attracted to everybody they meet. It just means they're attracted to both men and women. All right. Lesbian is basically what they would say is a homosexual female. She identifies as woman. So it means you're a woman basically attracted to the same sex, to other women and other women only. Now, you probably have heard of asexual. If you've not heard of it in humans, you've definitely heard of it in animals because we do have some asexual animals. Asexuals are people who don't feel any type of sexual attraction whatsoever. They don't identify at all with a sexual attraction of one or the other. They're still capable of being in healthy relationships now. Believe it or not, there are asexuals who are married because of companionship, but they're asexual. They don't have a sexual attraction to male or female. And now we're going to get to some that you may have never heard of. It's one of the most common sexual orientations out there. Pansexual is a person who's attracted to any sexual orientation. There's no limits to who they can be attracted to. I know it sounds like, well, I'm getting confused. I know, like I said, take notes, look this stuff up. Because I'm not going in as much detail as you can find because there's just so much detail out there. Trust me, it will have your head spinning. This is why I study the way that I do and I take time in studying. I also get with those who are professionals in these areas that I talk to. I also talk to people who identify as these different sexualities and learn from them as well. All right. Demisexual. Demisexual are people who aren't able to feel a sexual connection with someone until they feel a romantic connection with them. Basically, that means that they need to become friends before they become sexually involved. They are not people who just have this sexual attraction right off the bat. Demisexual person don't feel a sexual connection with someone until there has been a romantic connection. All right. Omnisexual, someone who feels an equal amount of attraction towards everyone. I know some of these are overlapping, by the way, but just remember there's different distinctives of each one. They don't actually prefer one gender over another. That almost sounds like pansexual, right? But remember, omnisexual feels an equal amount of attraction towards everyone. They don't prefer one or the other. They don't prefer men. If they're a woman, they don't prefer men. If they're a woman, they don't prefer women. The attraction that they have towards everyone is equal. Now, the sapiosexual, which I mentioned earlier in the broadcast, is a person who finds intelligence sexually attractive or arousing. This is the only way they can get sexually aroused, is if the person that they are with is intelligent. Intelligence turns them on. That's why most oftentimes with sapiosexuals, looks are not the thing for them. Sexual attraction is not the thing for them. In order to even get to sexual attraction, they first have to be turned on by the person's intellect. So that means that those who are relatively smart attracts a sapiosexual. All right. It doesn't matter how fine the guy may be. It doesn't matter how he may look. It doesn't matter how much money he has. None of that matters. It's all about his intellect. To even get to sex with her, if she's a sapiosexual, she first has to be attracted to his intelligence. I hope that makes sense. So we know about transsexual, a person who emotionally and psychologically feels that they belong to the opposite sex. Some people even identify as intersex. And we're not going to go into all of that, y'all. We don't have a lot of time. All right. There's also solosexual. I believe it or not, y'all, yes, there's solosexual, and it's not to laugh at them. I'm just saying a lot of people, when they hear about solosexual, they're looking like, what? Solosexual is one who prefers masturbation over other forms of sex. Someone who masturbates a lot, but has absolutely no desire whatsoever to ever have sex with someone else. If y'all have ever seen the movie Titanic, I think it came out back in like 1997, 20 years ago. The actress that played Rose, Gloria Stewart, she actually was identified as a solosexual. She came out some years after the movie and talked about how she had been a solosexual forever. And she made a quote. It's still around. You can search for it. She says, "I do not need a man. I'm devoted to masturbation. I think it's probably one of the most pleasurable experiences in my life. I've had and have no guilt whatsoever when it comes to pleasure in myself." That's a solosexual. They are into masturbation, basically, and they're not into other forms of sex. I need y'all to really be aware of solosexual, because many of these solosexuals are married in heterosexual marriages. Yup. Found this out as time went on, that there are some men, we know of some men who are solosexuals, but they got married because they wanted to have children. Now, and let me just make a little bit of a change in a solosexual. It says that they have absolutely no desire whatsoever to ever have sex with someone else. Doesn't mean that they never have sex with someone else. It just means the desire to have sex is not there. They prefer to masturbate. Many people will see that as addictions to masturbation, and it's wrong and it's sinful because they believe masturbation is sin, especially if you're single. But solosexuals are saying, listen, we do get married. We do have children because we want to build a nation, we want to have a legacy and whatnot. But I just have no interest in really having sex with my wife. I would prefer to masturbate. That's a solosexual. I know it may sound crazy to y'all, especially if y'all haven't heard it, but this is the truth. Now, there's autosexual. Now I'm laughing, y'all. I'm not laughing at the sexualities, but I'm laughing because I'm picturing the responses of many of y'all listen to this. This is just cracking me up because I know I've seen it. Oftentimes when I have discussions about these things, I've seen people's reactions and they're just like, what the heck? What? So it's kind of funny thinking about the reaction that some of you may have, but it's not directed at the person's sexuality. Autosexual is about the person becoming only sexually interested in themselves, and they have no interest in dating or being sexual with others. Yes, there are autosexuals out there. They are literally just attracted to themselves. I know, they're sexually interested in no one but themselves. That means they may do what the solosexual do, but the autosexual is not going to get married. Most times they're not getting married. They're not choosing to get married. Does that mean autosexuals are not married? No, there are some autosexuals who are married, but that's not their thing. They're not really interested in marriage. And I know some men like that. And what happens is they got talked into getting married. And then the wife is like, why doesn't my husband want to have sex with me? What's wrong with me? Okay. And that's kind of like what we're headed to with this. Now let's talk about the romantics. Biromantic. Biromantic are people who feel romantic attraction to both men and women. Yeah, like I told y'all earlier, sexual attraction and romantic attraction are actually two completely different things. So biromantic people feel romantic attraction to both men and women. That means, you ever heard of the terminology bromance? Those are two men who actually are romantically attracted to one another. They don't have sex with one another. They don't want to be with each other like that, but they have a romantic attraction to one another. And so do y'all know what romance is? A romance is simply a feeling of excitement and mystery associated with love. That's all it is. It's a quality or a feeling of mystery, excitement, and remoteness from everyday life, from other people you're around. It doesn't mean anything of a sexual nature. That doesn't mean that romance and sex can't take place. It just means that romance is a feeling of excitement and mystery associated with love. That's why you have what's called bromance. There are two men or men who have a feeling of excitement and mystery associated with the love they have for each other as brothers, as human beings or whatnot. Now, I admit, when I first heard of this terminology some years ago, I thought that was too gay for me. And that's exactly the way that I worded it at that time. Too gay for me. That's gay. You hear people on the internet say it all the time, man, that's gay. Y'all gay. That's whatever. But these men actually do not have sex with each other. They just love being with one another, and they have what's called a bromance. There are many scholars of today who are saying that that's what David and Jonathan had. And that's why the Bible talks about how the love they have for one another. What does it say? It says, when David had finished speaking to Saul, the son of Jonathan was bound to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. This is how men and women love each other in marriage. It's covenant. So listen. Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David. These are two men who had a covenant with one another. Because why? Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. Then Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that he was wearing and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. If you had put a woman there when that the soul of Jonathan was bound to the soul of Bathsheba, let's say, it would be like a beautiful romantic story. But when you put a man there, you become questionable. You just say, well, it's just brotherly love, right? He gave, a man gave another man all of his most precious and prized possessions. That was a big thing. You know, armor and weapons of a prince back then were important symbols of his power and his status. So that was big. So actually, if you put a woman there in place of any of those men, it would make more sense to you. But when you look at it as just two men, you kind of like, what? That's why a lot of people who are homosexuals think that they were homosexuals. I'm not saying that they are. I'm saying that you have to understand romance is not the same as something sexual. Romance is like what I said it is. And we need to understand that, so that when men have these types of relationships with one another, it doesn't mean that they're gay. It doesn't mean that they want to even have sex with these men. Romance is simply a feeling of excitement and mystery associated with love. That's all it is. It's an excitement. They see one another. There's charming. It's an appeal, if you will. So anyway, I just want to share that with y'all because people read so much more into things and want to call everything as gay and dismiss it. I think we need to stop doing that as the body of Christ. We need to be researching more and understanding these terminologies more so we can better associate with not only just people different from us, but even understand our own relationships that we have with people and why. Okay? All right, we just had another awesome podcast, and I thank you all for tuning in once again. I will be back in your ear next Wednesday, so make sure you tune in for part 2. And we stop with what? Biromantic? So there's more. So y'all just make sure you stay tuned and be back here next Wednesday. I'm sorry I couldn't get it all down into just one part, but there's so much more to this. Even in part 2, it will still be so much information left out there to find out. But until then, I will wrap this up next Wednesday. So make sure you tune in. Ben Summer, thanks again for the music for the podcast. And I just want to shout out to all of y'all who's been listening and following the podcast. I really appreciate you. And I cannot wait to be in your ear again next Wednesday. If you have some confusion and need some clarity on anything I've said, and you need an appointment, things coming up in your own life, make sure you hit me up at workwithoev.com. And if you would like to be on the mailing list for my next Sex for Ladies workshop, make sure you go to 4ladies.com and sign up to be notified. Again, if you need an appointment, hit me up, workwithoev.com. If you would like to be notified of my next Sex for Ladies workshop, go to 4ladies.com. All right, be with you next Wednesday. Once again, we are in this thing to do this for life. Much love, y'all.